drawing from during today's lecture called Liberated Threads, Black Women's Style and the Global Politics of Soul. So some of the information that you may have remembered from TMD 240 and from Dr. Gagnon's class may spark some threads of remembrance as you go through this lecture today. So without further ado, we welcome Dr. Ford to show us.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for the invitation. We were talking in the office earlier, and I was expressing how much I'm really indebted to Professor Welter's work. When I was a graduate student, really formulating a lot of the ideas for my book, I really turned her work and relied a lot upon her research and ideas about the importance of dress for Americans. And so in many ways I see that conversation as a launching point into what I'm going to do today. But first let me just check the sound here. Can you hear me? Okay, but let me know if I get too loud, because sometimes you start feeling it and you get really like, before you know it, everybody's like, okay, you're yelling at us, like, calm down. So I just wanted to check to make sure what my relationship to sound was. But yeah, I am a historian by training. I was trained in 20th century U.S. history at Indiana University, with a specialty in African American history and the history of social movements, history of the African diaspora, so thinking about peoples of African descent who have moved away from the continent either by force or by choice in terms of migration and immigration, but people who are in parts of the world outside of Africa but who are of African descent. I also have a specialty in Black women's history, so a lot of the work that I do is centered on Black women. And some emerging interests include material culture, fashion studies, and so forth. So just to give you a sense of some of the ways that I'm thinking about fashion and some of the questions that I want to ask of my research, I want to ask you all a question. And that is, tell me what went through your mind when you chose what you were going to wear to campus today. It can be anything. It doesn't have to be anything particularly deep, but just go ahead.
I want to be comfortable.
I want to be comfortable. Okay, so what did you wear? What signals comfort to you?
I knew it wasn't gonna be too hot, and it wasn't gonna be too cold either. So I wanted to wear a sweater, and I'll be fine with this.
Okay.
And I brought a coat just in case I get too cold, because I get cold easily.
Okay. All right, so comfort. How many people said comfort? Comfort was their reason. All right, so a lot of comfort. Anybody else for reasons other than comfort? Go ahead.
To rely on a professor, right? So every morning I wake up and I think, I really should try to look professional.
Right, okay.
I'm not sure I succeed, but it runs through my mind.
Okay, right. So there, I have that feeling too as well. Like, okay, how do I look professional? How do I signal? Especially because I look, I guess, youngish. I'm not necessarily young anymore, but youngish for a professor. So how do I say that I am an authority figure in the room? How do I communicate that, through my clothing? Another thing I thought about was practicality. I had to take a train here from New York. So I thought if I had to haul it through Penn Station, what shoes could I do that haul in, right? Like what shoes would be comfortable? So I decided to not wear stilettos and wear a more accessible shoe. Another thing, this is like TMI, but we're all friends here, right? You think, if I'm going to give a talk, I want to make sure that I'm wearing something that if I perspire, you can't see it, So there's all kinds of practical reasons why we decide to wear what we're going to wear. How many people feel like they put a lot of effort into their look, even if they feel like they're just coming to campus? Okay, why? There's several hands who said that. Why? Why do you put effort into it?
Just because you're a community major, so like if that's what you're going to be doing for the rest of your life, you want to start now like thinking about it, your style.
Yeah, you want to think about your style as an extension of you, as an extension of your brand, as an extension of the fact that you are in the fashion world. So you want to kind of look the part, if you will. Okay, other folks, thoughts about why you put effort into what you wear? Now, there were a bunch of hands. Okay, there we go.
If I'm confident when I'm wearing, I'll feel more confident that day.
Right, so this sense of, if I look good, I'll feel good. So I want to put on clothes that make me feel good. I want to style my hair in ways that make me feel good. What about, does anybody dress out of safety? Do you choose things that you wear in order to feel safe? Why? What does that mean for you?
I do it when I'm gonna go out usually. Like, I don't really wear things that are see-through just because I know if it's gonna be late at night and I may find myself in a situation where I may not feel safe. I don't know, I feel like if I don't have clothes that provoke unsafety, I wouldn't wear that. I don't know if I explained it right, but.
Yeah, right. So there's a way that when we are in environments, particularly environments where we feel like either our bodies are read as non-normative in these spaces, or if people might perceive us a particular way, you might dress as a way to protect yourself or to communicate something through your dress. And for a lot of people of color, people in the LGBTQ community, etc., like these are real serious concerns. Like how do you dress to protect yourself? Okay, so is that Rihanna? It's very fitting to have her presence in the space because she's a fashion icon. Okay, so these are some of the ideas that animate my work. I wanted to study how it is and why it is that Black women have been invested in dress for the whole host of reasons that you all have mentioned. Why style matters for Black women. That was like one of the big picture research questions that I had, and I'll get into more about how I did this work and how I went about like traveling around the world to gather evidence to do this work tonight during the talk. But for today, I just wanted to give you all a sense of what I found as I was doing that work and how I'm making meaning of it. So I'm going to show you all some images, and I want you to work with me to analyze the images that I'm showing you so we can make some connections here. So, like I said, I was thinking about how and why why dress mattered for Black women. In particular, I was fascinated with my mother's generation. The generation of Black women who came of age during the Civil Rights and Black Power movement era of the mid-20th century. So I wanted just to understand, well, why is it that all of a sudden everyone seemed to be wearing an afro? Like, what did that signal for them? Why is it that African prints became really popular in the 1970s? Like, what were some of the conversations that women were having about their dress bodies, and men as well, to the point where the style that during the time was called soul became the look of the day. Okay, so if you think about afros, dashikis, the black leather jackets of the Black Panther Party, so on and so forth, these became the looks of the day. And I found that there was a way that style mattered for a lot of these practical reasons, but that it was also an outward sign of one's political commitments. So if I, for example, today, if you're involved in Black Lives Matter, there's a way you might dress in a way that signals that you are a member of that movement, or that you believe in Black Lives Matter and you're committed to that. Right? So there's a way that in this time period, young people in particular were wearing clothing that signaled that Black is beautiful. I'm Black and I'm proud. Black power. I'm a soul sister. I'm a soul brother. Right? And so the clothing was an outward manifestation of that feeling on the inside. So if I dress in a way that communicates that Black is beautiful, I will believe and feel that Black is beautiful. Similar to the comment that was made earlier about if I dress in a way that makes me feel good, then I will exude confidence. So I want to dig into some of this information for you today. So let's start with this image of my mother. This is one of the first things that I came across, even before this was a project or I even knew that it would be a project. I looked at this photo a million times. It was in the photo albums. This is back before like digital photography. So everybody in their home had a big photo album with tons of photos. And this is one of my mother from her taken in her dorm room in 1972. She was a student at Indiana University, Wilmington. That's actually the institution that I graduated from in undergrad and then also went back to for graduate school. And this is a picture of my mom and her friends. My mom is in the blue shirt. Can you look at this picture and tell me what you see? Go ahead.
Bead curtains.
Right. So what do the bead curtains symbolize for you?
Well, I remember them when I was a kid. My mother had them in our house, and they just the loudest things. It was distracting, and it was part of her time. So she had them in the doorway, and it was just signaling you're going in, signaling you're going out. So.
Yeah, I mean, and that's true because we would always put those beads in the most like the oddest places, like going like the space between the kitchen and the living room or something. So you had to go through the beads in order to get in. Yeah, so she definitely has these beads, and she found a way to suspend them from her ceiling, right over her bed. I don't know, was it like a curtain to come out the bed? I have to ask her about it. But other things you noticed from the picture. The hair, what about the hair? Right, so, okay, so no shade, but, so this is my mom, this is her quote-unquote natural hair, right? Her friend, to me that looks like an afro wig. And I bring this up not to shade folks who wear wigs, but to, because I'm going to come back to this point later. So this is 1972, you know, you have women who are wearing afros, whether it be their own hair or their own hair because they bought it, right? So these two women are wearing afros. Other things that you see in the picture.
Are they sitting on the floor? Or are they sitting on the bed?
So they're sitting on her bed, which brings me to the bedspread that you see here. It is, she designed this herself. She sewed it. It's in the colors of the Pan-African unity flag. And so that was her comforter that she used to say, right, I'm black and I'm proud. I even sleep black, you know. I got my comforter here and red and black, and I think she has some green accents somewhere on there. Other things.
The bright colors, like blue and red, and I can't tell what the poster is behind,
Yeah,
but
can anybody?
right.
Yeah, can anybody make out that poster? You said so. Somebody said it looks like Jimi Hendrix. Anybody else? Okay, so somebody says it's not Jimi Hendrix, but it is someone. What if I said it was a famous woman, radical activist, and you know this is 1972? Who might you think it is? Okay, I'll tell you. It's Angela Davis. Does anybody know who Angela Davis is, other than a radical activist? She's also a professor, a well-known, internationally known intellectual, political theorist, like I said, a political activist who was very much linked and a member of the Communist Party USA. She was a professor at UCLA during the time that Ronald Reagan was actually governor of California, and she was, they tried to fire her for her relationship involvement in the Communist Party. The Board of Regents decided that they could not fire her, but then the following year, guns that were registered in her name were used in the kidnapping of a judge and some other members of the court in California, and someone was killed. So then she was placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, and she fled California and traveled really across the United States trying to flee J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI who were pursuing her. She's eventually caught and is put in jail, and there's this international campaign to free Angela Davis. And there's some really good documentaries on her if you ever want to watch those. But what's also important here is that Angela Davis, in these years between 1970 and 1972, she became a symbol of Black is beautiful, of this radical Black beauty where Black women were no longer going to wear their hair pressed and curled. They were going to wear their hair in its natural state. So a lot of people even referred to that afro as an Angela Davis fro, right? So she becomes the face of the style. So for my mother, Angela Davis was a role model. She wanted to be like Angela Davis, okay? So why does any of this matter? Well, it matters for a number of reasons. One reason is that this is a moment, and very few people recognize this, but this is a moment between 1968 and 1972, when my mother goes off to college, where African Americans' enrollment at both predominantly white institutions and historically Black colleges and universities in the United States increased from a little more than 400,000 to a little more than 700,000, with most of these students now attending predominantly white institutions. So think about it. A lot of these young folks, like my mother, grew up in racially segregated cities. So most of them went to predominantly Black high schools where you saw people who looked like you every day. But then imagine what that feels like when you leave that community where you have your friends, your family, your social groups, your dance squad, your, young authors league, your church, and you go to a community where very few people look like you. Where in that space, your Black body is put on display in a way. You are both hyper visible in that everyone can see that you are somehow not like them, but you're also invisible because people don't really want to know you. There are no activities and organizations on campus designed to cater to your experiences as Black women or Black men too. So this was a moment where Black students started to protest to have Black studies programs on campus, women's studies programs on campus, to have more organizations and activities that were geared to young Black people. So when my mom decides that she's going to deck out her side of the dorm room in the Pan-African colors of the Pan-African Unity flag, with the beads, with her afro, with Angela Davis on the wall, she's trying to claim a sense of self and a space for herself in a predominantly white institution wherein she is largely marginalized. Okay, so her dorm room becomes a safe haven, and her clothing becomes a way for her to try to maintain some of her sense of self and her sense of humanity as she's walking around campus. And I don't know what you all know about Indiana. That may seem like a far and distant land from Rhode Island, but this was the heart of Ku Klux Klan country, all right? One of the major hubs for the Klan was right down the street in Martinsville. And in 1968, I believe it was, a Black woman who was selling encyclopedias was actually murdered by a member of the Klan. So when Black students are coming to this campus, there is a heightened sense of awareness of their Blackness in this space, and that being Black in this space is actually dangerous. And the city of Bloomington would allow the Klan members to come to campus and march through downtown Bloomington, which runs right through campus. And so Black students were in many ways in fear of what this might mean for their presence on campus. And also the reality that the Klan could march through their campus, but when Black students congregated in groups, then campus police will come and bust that up. Like, what are you doing? Like, what are you plotting? Why are you hanging out all together, right? So there are these real issues that occur when you have this influx of Black students on college campuses. But then what also happens is that we're in the midst of a moment of political upheaval in the country, right? So what are some of the social movements that are taking place in the late 1960s and early 1970s? We mentioned like the Black Power movement. What are some other things that are happening on college campuses? Go ahead.
Streaking.
Streaking! and so what's streaking a response to?
authority.
Yeah, okay, so people are really challenging the authority of the campus. So in the historical moment in particular, before this one, on college campuses, administrators had the right to function as like the parental guardians of students. So we see a student movement that responds to that seemingly absolute control of campus administrators. They're responding to exorbitant costs to attend college. They are trying to force college administrators to divest from various entities or businesses in which they may have relationships. So for example, at this time, the divestment from South Africa was a big deal. People, they didn't want universities that have ties to South Africa because it upheld apartheid, which was legalized segregation. There's also a women's rights movement, gay rights movement, there's an anti-war movement. So there's a way that students on campuses are really mobilized politically. And even those who weren't a part of formal organizations use their dress as a way to signal their commitment to like radical approaches to activism, to youthful rebellion, and so forth. So at this time, then, the black press says, well, we want to try to chronicle what's going on on these campuses for black women, but also we want to show them how they could have a good experience as co-eds on these campuses, like what they should be doing. So Essence Magazine, which is founded in 1970s, decides it's going to launch its college special issue, which is all geared towards black women. And a lot of the articles are like 7-page fashion spreads where they're like, this is what's hot on campus. This is what you should be wearing if you want to be a soul sister, if you want to be in style. They're also telling them things like, this is the food you can make. If you use a hot plate, you can make soul food in your dorm. You can make soul food, what are those, like Vienna sausages and soul food, rice-a-roni, so. And then there are these articles that are more lighthearted are also juxtaposed with articles that tackle more serious issues, like what is it like to be the only black woman in your class? What does that feel like? What does it feel like to go from being the cheerleading captain in your high school to not even being able to make the squad, in large part because of your race? So they're dealing with all these variety of issues. This image is one that I found in the Indiana University, what's it called, yearbook at the time. And it is the tall chapter of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. This definitely stuck out to me because I'm a member of this organization and I actually pledged this chapter. And it was shocking to me that all of these women in Alpha Kappa Alpha, this organization that upholds a particular type of respectability, if you will, were saying, oh, we're going to wear our hair in afros. So to me, it spoke to the ubiquity of the afro in this time period for black college women, that even the most, refined, middle class, we wear pearls, black women were saying, well, an afro is beautiful, and we're black and beautiful. You might see that little dog in her lap there. It took me forever to see that. Somebody pointed that out when I gave a talk. So this was their picture that they used to represent their sorority in the yearbook. And then you also see them wearing that jumpsuit that was hugely popular in the 1970s. Everybody had one. So in that way, they're on trend. I'm assuming that this woman in the middle is the chapter president, which is why she's wearing a different color. Now this image for me really stuck out because there are certain things today that we would just take for granted about how college students dress. But in this picture, I was like, okay, knowing the historical moment that precedes this one, this picture was telling for me. So let's see, you all are folks who know some fashion history. What to you sticks out about how they're dressed if I tell you that this picture was taken in the early 1970s? Well, so this would have been pre-Run DMC. So
this is before.
Right, but that is important. You're noting that this is a moment where we start to see a rise in athletic wear. and that young college age students are the ones who are wearing them. So he has on the Adidas t-shirt, you can see a foot underneath the table, it looks like someone is wearing Adidas. So this leisurely wear is popular. Other things you might notice about their dress. Okay.
It looks like she's wearing a jean miniskirt.
Yes! So why does that stick out for you?
That was like a staple, is that what you?
Right, so, we have the mini skirt, it's made out of denim, those things together and combined, that matters, right? How we get to this moment where mini skirts are like all the rage. Did you have your hand up too?
Oh, the shades.
Yes. Shade. Okay, this is the Black Student Union library. You got the shades on while you read. Oh, you were literally too cool for school. What are you gonna say about the shades?
Lots of 1950s jazz musicians.
Right. So we have shades. We have the denim mini skirt. We have the Adidas wear. It looks like this guy has on like a beaded necklace. So there's a way that there's a really good book about this by Deirdre Clemente. It's all about how casual attire became the look on college campuses. Because in the 1950s, that was not the case. You would come to class dressed what we would call like dressed up, in like your Sunday's best. And it was these young people who started to push back against some of those dress codes on campus, which mandated that women not wear their legs bare, that you had to wear dresses and skirts at all times. One of my mentors who went to Spelman College in the early 1960s said they got a laundry list of things that they were supposed to bring with them on campus, including a girdle, after 5 wear, after 6 wear, tons of stockings because you couldn't wear socks even. You couldn't wear shoes, open-toed shoes. So there's all these dress codes that students start to challenge, and so this moment for me was very telling where being a soul brother or a soul sister also meant too flexing your right to dress more casually on campus. So I hear the responses, which is so telling. It always happens every time I show this image. Okay, so just initial reactions to these two images here. Thoughts?
I'm just saying that I scan that pattern.
Okay, so we have a simplicity pattern, and we have an ad from Eleganza that would have run in like Ebony or Sepia, any of the black lifestyle magazines of the day. What is striking about the difference between these two images? I almost labeled this like the dashiki in black and white. So what is a dashiki?
Well, it's originally an African garment, and they became very popular in the 70s. I actually worked in a fabric department where they sold the panels to make these.
Oh wow! So just like a front and a back, and you would just stitch them together.
Just one panel that
Oh,
was
okay.
printed already, and then you just cut the neck.
out.
Yeah, sew it up the sides.
Okay, so the dashiki. It's like, what is the origin of the dashiki? I think various African countries, sub-Saharan African countries, have a version of it. It's a man's shirt. It's usually a shirt that's worn by men, but it became a unisex style, not only in the United States, but in various parts of Africa as well. And for African Americans, wearing a dashiki became the way to say you were black as hell, right? Like, I'm black, I'm proud of my African roots. I'm so black, in fact, that I'm going to rock a dashiki everywhere, right? So this became just part of the regular wear. People would have different debates about how authentically black you were based on the fabric that your dashiki was made out of. So maybe if you could travel to the continent you know, and have some fabric and, you know, have a dashiki made for you and come back with that, it was like, whoa, I mean, you are really authentically black. So all this stuff is being debated, right? But then maybe your dashiki was made out of a thin, cheap fabric that when you flipped it over, you could see that it wasn't double-sided, right? That it was just a print on a cheap fabric. And so there were debates in these magazines about African Americans wearing dashikis and what this meant. But by and large, people would wear the dashiki as a celebration of their roots. And if you look at a lot of the publications of the day, both that circulated both through the black media in the United States, but then also in other parts of Africa and its diaspora, you can see tons of people wearing dashikis. And dashikis are actually making a comeback now. Beyonce is one of the people who's helping to repopularize the dashiki. And so it's a guy who I think is of Ghanaian descent who is designing some of these dashikis. And he might have a deal with like Forever 21, where I think Forever 21 is going to start mass producing his dashikis, but a lot of them have like Accra, 1954 on them or something, right? So he's marking Ghana, he's marking particular historical moments in Ghanaian history, and Beyonce has become one of his clients. But then, as we can see, the dashiki becomes a style for other markets as well, right? Not just for African Americans. And in fact, this simplicity as a pattern is imagining what the dashiki would look like on a white body, right? So their target audience of consumers not being African Americans necessarily. But this was a common theme that we saw outside of like the black press and the black community, where these styles were being worn on non-black bodies. And this again was another point of contention. Once this culture starts to be mass produced in the early 1970s, what does it mean to have non-black people wearing a dashiki? Do they have the right to wear it? It sounds a lot about our conversations on appropriation today, right, on cultural appropriation. And people tend to have very strong feelings about what all this means. And we can talk about this if you all feel inclined to do so once I wrap up here. So another thing that happens, which is why I said it matters to me about my mother's friend and saying she's wearing a wig, and that wasn't shade, but that was just, I think, what was happening in that picture. We start to see then companies saying, okay, the afro is really popular among black women in particular, but a lot of folks cannot wear their own afro for a number of reasons. Maybe your hair wouldn't kink up enough, right? Because if you're going to wear an afro, you have to have a certain hair texture in order to make your hair fro out in that big, luscious halo. It might be that you were still living at home with your parents, and maybe your mama really wanted you to keep wearing your hair pressed and curled, but when you would dip out to a party with your friends, you could take your afro wig with you, you could dance at the party that night with your afro wig, take it off, come home, and you still have this hairstyle. Or maybe you worked in a job where you couldn't wear an afro during the week, but on the weekends you could wear the style. Other people wore them for health reasons because they were already wearing other types of wigs, and say if your hair was thinning or if you had other health concerns or alopecia, for example, you might wear an afro wig so that you could still be on trend, but that you could preserve what hair follicles you might have still had or been trying to grow back. And then some people just wore them because they were just in style. So we start to see tons of afro wig ads in the U.S. Black press at this time. This would have been, I think, some of the earliest the conversations I started to see about afro wigs and the rise of afro wigs were in the late 1960s, so roughly 1968, 1969. What then happens, if you can imagine, is similar to today, where top black designers would partner with wig companies. Some of them were black owned, some of them were white owned, and they would serve as the creative director for the wig line, and they would celebrity endorse the wig, right? They would use their cachet as the stylist to the stars to endorse the wig company and tout its technological advances, how they were using the most advanced fibers, which is usually nylon, to make these wigs, right? These are lifelike wigs. So here's an example of a couple of Afro wig ads that ran in black magazines at the time. If you can see, there are different shapes, and even there's the Afro puffs there that were also popular. One of the designers who is instrumental, or the hairstylist who's instrumental in designing wigs for one of these companies, says to Sepia magazine that he predicts that the wig would be the hottest export, America's hottest export in decades. And so as a researcher, as a historian, I'm reading this and I'm thinking like, huh, wow, okay, interesting. What an interesting claim, because now with my presentist knowledge, we know that the Afro circulates all over, it circulates very widely. But to hear someone make that declaration for me was very interesting. And I kept it in mind, and when I started doing work for the book that took me outside of the United States, so I'm trying to think about, okay, if black women are protesting and they're participating in black power movements and women's rights movements, and they're feminists, and they're wearing the attire that reflects some of those politics, then what's happening in other parts of Africa and its diaspora? So I went to South Africa to do some research, and similarly dug around in some of their old magazines and came across this ad in Drum magazine, which would have been the South African equivalent of Ebony. And I found this thing that ran in April 1970 that says, "It's here at last." She's talking about the Afro wig. So in 1968, the man tells Sepia that he's predicting that the Afro wig is going to be the hottest export from the U.S. And in 1970, Drum runs its first ad for an Afro wig. So it is selling the Afro wig to black South African women. So the gist of this ad here is that this woman who has a column in Drum, who brings all the latest mail-to-order goods to our clients, is saying, now you can look like the hip, fashionable women in the United States and London. You can, in England, and you can have your own Afro wig. If you just put down a small deposit, we can put you can basically put your Afro wig on layaway, right? And do they still have layaway? Or is that like a very 80s thing? Do they still do that? Okay, so you can put your Afro wig on layaway. So you can be on a payment plan to get your Afro wig. And these wigs became very popular in South Africa. So in the United States they were popular too, but in South Africa they were popular for a different set of reasons. One was that the Afro itself was a style that represented modernity. Okay, so by this point in the United States, the Afro is pretty ubiquitous. It's all over. You can find a variety of people, from the women of Alpha Kappa Alpha to my mother, to Diana Ross, to Michael Jackson and the Jackson 5, to Huey Newton and the Black Panthers, to Angela Davis wearing an Afro. So in that regard, it became something that was on trend in other parts of the world, in the West in particular. And in the South African context, but also in other parts of Africa, to call something Afro meant you were saying it was Black American. Okay, so instead of calling this look soul style in South Africa, they called it the Afro look, meaning the Black American look. So we can adopt the look that black women in the United States and black women in England have popularized, these two, particularly Britain being this major global fashion hub. These styles that are popular there, now we can have access to this. And for women who were living under a system of legalized segregation, being able to participate in a modern culture mattered, okay? But just like in the United States, there were arguments about well, should we be wearing things that are imported from the West? Is this a form of Western encroachment on our culture? Why would we want to cover up our own natural hair, which other people in the world are naming this style the Afro because of its African roots? Why would we allow them to sell our own thing back to us? Right? So these become some of the debates that are taking place on the pages of Drum magazine. But nevertheless, these wig ads were all over Drum magazine. And if you can see here, a lot of them, so some of them are made in the United States, but most of the ones that are imported to South Africa are ones that are produced in the UK. So these in particular are produced in London. So instant fashion, the latest Afro wig style for the new you, at parties, at discotheques, dancing, swinging, right? So to be a modern woman meant that you were a part of this, what they called in the magazines at that time, the jet set crew, right? Like you were a part of South Africa's elite. Elite not necessarily referring to your economic status, but referring to the fact that you were up on all the latest trends. You were stylish, you were in the know, you were the socialite who was at all the parties, and your Afro wig would serve you well. So most often these wigs, and Afro wigs, but wigs in general, were really being sold to women like you all. College educated South African women, women who wanted to have jobs outside the home. Oftentimes we're talking about women who lived in the urban cities of South Africa, like Johannesburg, like Cape Town, Durban, and so forth. And also women who could speak English. That's another issue here, because Drum is a magazine that's it's printed, once it becomes really popular, it gets printed in some of the local languages, but for the most part, it's circulating in English. So we have these wig ads, and then this one that I think makes a very sharp argument about modernity, again, and what the modern South African woman looks like versus what she doesn't. Now this might be very specific, but I want to have you all look at this image and tell me what you see. Or if you can even read it. I think it's a little dim, but if you can read it, what does it say here? Can someone read the top for me? Go ahead.
It says this is the old-fashioned way.
Right. This is the old-fashioned look. And then what does the bottom say? Right. This is the new look from Cool Look Wigs. Okay. So the old-fashioned look. This is really interesting. It's hard to make out some of these styles, but you have your short crop style, kind of like the one I'm wearing right now. I guess I'm old-fashioned, right? So this is the look that Miriam Makeba, who was a South African singer, popularized. But the one I really want to point out is the woman with the headscarf on. Now there are headscarves that are like the gele, which is the stylish West African way of wrapping the hair, and then other cultures also have a similar wrapping technique. But then there's also this scarf, which is the scarf that's worn by women who work in the home. So these would have been women who these young women would have called traditional. These are the traditional South African women who get married and have kids and stay at home. And if you look at ads in Drum magazine, the things that were catered to the modern women were wigs, they were skin creams, body pomades and talcum powders, perfumes, and the things that were geared, that were advertised towards women who were more the quote-unquote traditional women who stayed home, always showed them wearing this headscarf, and they were in house coats, and it was things like dishwashing liquid, laundry detergent, bathroom soap, toilet paper. Okay, so Cool Look Wigs is saying the old-fashioned look were all these things that represented our mothers, their way of life, their way of hairstyling, and these wigs, which include the Afro wig, are part of the new look. These are what, if you're going to be a modern urban woman, you need to look like this. You need to look the part. Okay. So for me, this was a really telling visual of some of the cultural divides within the Black South African community about what modern, hip, politically conscious women should be doing. And then one of the last ads I want to show you is an article that ran in Drum magazine called African fashion getting its own back, okay? Just from the title of this and the images that you see here, what do you think this article was about? Given what we talked about with the popularity of the dashiki and the afro, given the political context that we've talked about a little bit here, what do you think this article is trying to tell drum readers? Right, reclaiming your culture. What might they be trying to reclaim and why? Go ahead.
Traditional African patterns,
Right.
like long, I don't know how to describe it, like long and flowing, traditional.
Okay, good. Is there anyone here who knows some of the history about how African fashions become, or African-inspired fashions become in vogue in other parts of the Western world in particular? Anyone? Okay, so a few things are happening. One, on the grassroots level, you have African Americans who for decades have been trying to figure out what their African roots are and what their connection to Africa is. So some of the more do-it-yourself styles that I mentioned, like my mother who sewed her own clothes, I have an image in the book where she's wearing a maxi dress in zebra print with a matching zebra print gele. And for her, she was like, that was Africa. I look African, right? That was her image of Africa. That was what Africa looked like to her, and so she wanted to dress the part, okay? So a lot of people are doing this do-it-yourself fashion. People are also using mail order companies to buy not just African-inspired fashions, but also things from India. So saris were popular, kimonos. The ethnic look was in this moment. So mail order companies became a way to get some of these goods and have them shipped overseas. Other people went to boutiques, especially if you lived in a major city in the United States, like New York City, like Los Angeles, like the Bay Area, Oakland. You could find black-owned boutiques who would have these, authentic African mud cloths and other popular prints that they could then make garments for you in. So what then also happens, though, is that the world of haute couture responds and says, like, ooh, we're going to start making these high-end designer wares that are inspired by African textiles, African beading techniques, African silhouettes. So Yves Saint Laurent creates his African fashion line, and he becomes the darling of the fashion world for this line. And so it's this moment where South Africa and other countries in Africa are starting to say, wait a minute, what's up with this West versus West paradigm where Western designers are taking our traditional textiles and production techniques, and they're selling them for thousands of dollars and touting themselves as the center of the fashion world, as the arbiters of taste. But we in Africa are still trying to look Western. Why are we doing that? We need to reclaim our own fashion. We need to reclaim our own traditional cloths. We need to claim our own designers. We have designers on the continent as well. We need to reclaim these people. We need to tout their good works as well. We have very capable seamstresses and tailors. So what they're doing in this ad is they're saying, in this article, they're saying, we've made these pictures large enough for you that you can take them to your local seamstress and you can have her replicate these looks. We need to be invested in us. We need to be invested in our own. If we don't celebrate us, and if we don't reclaim our works, then who will? Our innovations will be lost to the world. Okay, so they also instruct people what you should do is you should get some East African cotton, which is high quality, expensive cotton, and have the garments made out of that. But if you can't afford that, they're telling people other cottons and other materials that they can take to their seamstress to have them replicate these looks. And for me, this was really important to think about how in a moment when South Africa is fighting against apartheid and African Americans are fighting against the remnants of Jim Crow segregation that's now been legally abolished, but is still de facto segregation. When Afro-Britons are fighting against de facto segregation too, that just means like it's not legal, but in fact, in the everyday realities, people are in segregated communities. They're receiving inferior educations. They don't have equal access to housing. Some of the same things we're still fighting for today, right? Like this was a movement around the world, and in all these places, styles like this become the look or the way to express one's connection to other Black people in other parts of the world, one's connection to these global political movements, but also a way that Black women in particular are redefining what it means to be Black and woman in this time period. The clothing becomes a marker of this. So as I started here by asking, like, what were the things that informed your choices, I've tried to show you a variety of ways that Black women in particular are making choices about how to adorn their bodies in this moment where Black people around the globe are fighting for freedom. And in this moment, African-inspired wears and African-inspired hairstyles become globally popular, and there are these intense debates about what all this means for questions related to authenticity, questions related to the global economics and geopolitics, questions about sexism and also women's rights within these movements. So my book really tries to take up some of these issues and more fully flesh out why these things are happening. But just for this class, I wanted just to give you a visual snapshot of how this history that we now have come to accept as like the look of the 70s, how that history was made in the time period that my mother came of age. So I'll stop there.
Questions, comments?
It is. So Drum is an interesting publication in that it's had a variety of iterations. As with any publication that's been around since I think it was created in the 1940s. So it started off as kind of like something of a rag that really focused on like the criminal underworld of South Africa and South African sports and athletics. But once various African nations started to fight for independence from colonial rule, and once there's really this global movement for Black freedom, it decides it needs to shift its content to be more politically relevant and to also cater to the voices and experiences of South African women as well. But now it still exists, but now it's kind of gone back to being more of a tabloidy magazine, so more on the line of like Star magazine or one of those in the U.S.
I have a question about why white people started wearing afros?
Yeah, so that was another one of the questions when it came down to issues of cultural appropriation. So one of the interesting pieces of this, though, is that you have, this is a moment where a lot of white ethnic folks who had been painstakingly straightening their hair in order to make it conform to see this natural hair, natural beauty moment as the way to let their hair really do what it would naturally do if they weren't straightening it and ironing it and all these other things. But what other thing happens aside from that is that with the invent of the Afro wig, the Afro could become costume. And I think that there were a lot of issues with the Afro as costume because for Black folks, the Afro, of course, symbolized their pride and their heritage. Finally, we've claimed our pride in being Black, and our hair is a signal of this. And you want to be able to put on and take off Blackness like a costume. And so these were tense debates that often happened in the Black media of the time. And it's something we see today. Every Halloween, there's always a social media image where someone is wearing an afro wig and blackface, and it becomes an issue of like not only cultural appropriation, but one about blackface and putting on and taking off black cool. And so some of those debates were definitely taking place in the 1970s as well. But I think it is important to mention that whole natural hair movement around white ethnics as well, because that to me was a slightly different conversation. It did create some crossover where now you had Jewish or Italian singers who could now enter the soul market because they had the big curly afro, and so they could be on Soul Train with the afro, and it's like, oh, you a soul brother too. You're not black, but you got soul, right, because of your hair. So it's interesting, the black and white areas, but also that gray with who can be quote unquote authentically soulful. Yes.
Are you familiar with Victoria Rovine's work?
Yes, weren't we just looking at the book?
Global, Fashion Global, African Global Style, something like that.
Yeah. Well, is that the one? That's the one that you showed me? Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm trying to think if I've read that one.
It's a
They're
pretty
in the
recent publication last year.
yes, but in the last, I would say in the last 5 to 7 years, there have been so many texts on African fashion. A lot of them are really good, and so that book is one of them. Helen Jennings also has some good stuff. But it's really a lot of African Americanists, I think, in particular African American historians, but also people who study African Americans from different disciplinary vantage points, have kind of been late to the fashion conversation. Right? That we, for many years, and I'll talk about this tonight, about why it is I think that we haven't taken this issue seriously, even though black style matters so much, right? So Africanists are often the ones using fashion as a way to think about power, global economic currents, so on and so forth. So yeah, I definitely want to check out that book because it's a part of a body of scholarship that's really important.
So Tanisha is speaking again tonight, and it's not going to be exactly the same talk. So
No.
if you are interested, there's a flyer here.
Yes.
Otherwise, thank you very much.
Until 7. No, you literally have to make a poster. I know. Now we have to like Eva, what are you doing now? And then present it. No. Oh my god. Good luck.